I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between stories and games. I think that the two of them are actually very different from each other, but they're often intermingled and used together. A lot of game designers put stories into their game, and when that's done well, it's a beautiful, awesome thing. But it's really tricky because the two of them are really different. Like games are these interactive systems with rules and mechanisms and players, put inputs into these big machines and based on the rules and the mechanisms inside, the game returns some kind of output, right? And so it's like the system that is interactive with the player and it has an uncertain outcome. You're not totally sure what will come out of it because it depends on the rules of the game and the inputs of the player. Stories tend to be these more kind of like static, fixed things that are authored by the game designer in this case, or authored by whoever is writing them. And they have a kind of a beginning, middle, and end, and maybe are less interactive because that tends to be what traditional art is. It's not an interactive thing. It's a static thing that you can observe, analyze, but it's different, right? But since we use them together, since a lot of stories or a lot of games have stories, there is some sort of important relationship between these two. And I want to kind of get into what I think makes for good story in game. And I'm going to reference, as always, this awesome book, Rules of Play, this textbook that I reference a lot. They distinguish between two different kinds of narrative in games. The first is embedded narrative, and the second is emergent narrative. So embedded narrative is like the story that a game designer writes into the game to tell the player who they are and what they're doing and why they're playing this game and what their goals are. And it adds quite a bit of color and context to the game. And when it's done well, again, it's a beautiful, amazing thing because it enhances the gameplay and it's really interesting. And the other kind of narrative that you can have in a game is the narratives that emerge from the gameplay. It's the stories that are kind of authored by the gameplay itself. And so you can kind of think of like, oh, we were down bad and it was hard and we were the underdogs and we came back and won this game. That kind of hero's journey that emerges from the gameplay itself is a different kind of narrative than the narrative that's written in by the game designers. So I want to talk about why the emergent gameplay is so interesting to me and also why the embedded narrative to me is often kind of disappointing. Some of this is a matter of taste. Please don't get mad at me. But the thing about embedded narrative is that oftentimes these stories, for me personally, are a little bit disappointing because game designers are not fundamentally storytellers, and also games are not necessarily the best storytelling vehicle. They can be, and when stories are well written and good, like something like The Last of Us, that can be really, really interesting, and it can enhance the gameplay and make it more dramatic and make things a lot better. But oftentimes I find just personally these stories kind of coming up a little bit short. And if you're playing something like a good video game and between each little bit of gameplay, you have to watch 5 minutes of people talking, it can become tiresome and kind of frustrating because you're like, this is almost like a Netflix show that's like not that good. Why do I have to watch this in between doing gameplay? Because gameplay is what I'm here to do. I'm playing a game, right? I also think that embedded narratives often are not strictly necessary. So we kind of think of them as really important because it's players like to know who am I and what am I doing. But it's interesting to start thinking about like something like chess or like abstract games or puzzle games. They don't require a story at all. They might be a simulation of something, but they don't have like a story with characters and beginning, middle, and end. Similarly, there are games like Elden Ring that I think about that they have deep lore and that's available to players. Some people get really, really into it. Apparently, it's pretty interesting. I love these games, Elden Ring, Dark Souls, Bloodborne. Like, they're some of my favorite games of all time. I didn't engage with the lore or the fiction of it really at all. And I know that they took a great deal of time to write it, but that's just not the thing that I was interested in. I was interested in the game, the gameplay. And that was really the interesting part of the game to me. And so the story didn't really stick for me. And I was able to have this amazing experience of this game without engaging with the embedded narrative at all. I also think even of like Neon White, a game that had incredible, engrossing gameplay and like a stupid, bad story that I didn't really like at all. And I just skipped through every cutscene to get back to the gameplay. And I would honestly still rate that game incredibly highly, even though it had this story in it that was like, who really cares? So I think embedded narrative, when it's done well, when the authors of it are good at storytelling, and when it enhances the gameplay, that's really interesting and beautiful. But a game doesn't have to have embedded narrative to be a great game. And in fact, a game with embedded narrative that's disappointing could still be a successful, great game because fundamentally it's a game and not a story. But the kind of story, kind of narrative that I actually get so excited about is this emergent narrative, the second kind. Emergent narrative is the kind of story that comes out of gameplay. Going back to Elden Ring, I can talk about like this amazing experience I had in Elden Ring. Maybe the strongest memory I have from that whole game was right when I started. I'm like a level 1 guy with some crappy sword. I wandered off the main path and found myself in a trap that transported me to the other side of the world. And I was over there and I was like stuck in this cave with enemies who I wasn't strong enough to actually even do any damage to. And I got stuck over there and I couldn't even see the map. And I eventually just had to find a way to sneak out of this cave. And I found myself in an even crazier, more dangerous place. But it did allow me to finally get back to where I started. And many, many hours later, I returned there as a stronger character and was able to kill all those guys in the cave. And it was like this exciting, amazing, full on hero's journey that really was not scripted. It was a natural consequence of the player and the mechanisms and the leveling system and the fact that they put a trap towards the beginning of the game, which is a crazy, hilarious idea. And that's a moment that most other players didn't even have. It wasn't scripted. It was tied to the actual mechanisms of the game, and it emerged organically from my gameplay. That's the kind of stuff that I think is so great. Or you even look at something like D&D, which is like the storytelling is the gameplay, which is a really interesting twist and difference on this idea, and that works really well as well. And like people get extremely excited about that. I'm not like a big D&D player, but I know that that's like it's enormous and it's amazing and kind of magical. That's the kind of narrative in narrative in games that I think is so interesting and exciting. I also just think about like basketball. It's kind of a funny example to think about sports. Basketball, as all sports, have obviously no embedded narrative at all. No one has authored a story of basketball. But, you look at sports, you look at like ESPN's 30 for 30 series, you get great stories. A narrative emerges out of the gameplay. Fourth quarter comebacks in the playoffs will be talked about for decades. I think about this a lot because the games that I've made don't have story. And I've often wondered, am I missing something? Am I missing out on something? I'm not a storyteller. I'm not really a writer. It's not something that I focus on. Are my games missing something? And I think the answer I've sort of come to is that's not the thing that I do. And if you as a game designer are excellent at writing narrative and can weave the narrative into the gameplay in a way that enhances the gameplay, that's awesome. But if not, it's completely fine to have a game that has no story. And I think actually, in fact, it would be stronger to do that because it's better to just stick with the thing that you were good at in the first place, which is game design. Anyway, I want to see people talk about that more. I want to see people talk about the emergent narratives that come out of games rather than assessing games primarily on the story that was written into them, because game designers are not storytellers.